establishing them. And then we're going to switch over to Anita to further discuss some projects she's done in Haverford Township with establishing native plants and pollinator gardens. So I think we're going to hold questions until the end, but feel free to put anything you want in the chat, question wise, and some of us will try and monitor the chat while we're going on and answer questions as we go along, and then kind of answer them out loud at the end as well, if that's beneficial. All right. Oh, we're going fast. Sorry about that. Okay. So the landscape used to be a forest, like in this picture, and the water cycle works differently in a forest than it does in a traditional landscape suburbia, right? The trees capture a lot of that rainfall, and then they evaporate it back up in the atmosphere, and the water that makes it through that canopy soaks into the forest floors. There's a lot of water going into the ground, and there's very little runoff in a forested system. So like the song says, we've paved paradise, right? And we put up a parking lot, and we've created a lot of impervious surfaces. So a lot of asphalt, a lot of roofs. And one of those impervious surfaces pretty much is our lawns. Our lawns don't allow a lot of water to infiltrate through them. A lot of the soil is very compacted and the roots are very shallow. And so most of the water that lands on your lawn is going to turn into runoff in some way, especially if your lawn has a little bit of a slope. So the picture on the bottom is a lawn, and you can see the water pouring out of the gutter over the lawn, but you can also see there's a slight slope off to the left, and that water's just shooting down that hillside over the other grass into the driveway and then into the street, where it's going to be pumped into our streams via stormwater. So it's offering very little water quality benefits. And so this is kind of the situation we see, right? That's the Little Crumb Creek in Ridley Park Borough. That's the same gutter, the water's shooting out, and that's Little Crumb Creek in a heavy rain, right? I didn't take that picture from the bridge because the water was only an inch or two below the bridge. It eventually topped the bridge and caused massive flooding. So by having these landscaping systems on our property, we push the water off our land into the storm sewer system, where it leads to a lot of water quality issues, but it also leads to flooding issues. We all live in a watershed. We live in various parts of that watershed. And so sometimes the people at the top are putting excess water at the people at the bottom, and we can cause really massive flooding issues towards the bottom of the watershed when we don't think about how we're managing water on our properties. And so the situation is, before development, when we had more naturalized systems, we were getting a lot of water infiltration. That's important for streams when it's not raining out. That's where we get our flow in streams on a day like today when it didn't rain out. That's also important for water storage, for use for human needs in the future. We store a lot of water in the ground. And we had very little runoff, but now we have very little water going into the ground, which impacts water when it's raining out, when it's not raining out, right? The flow in our streams is limited when it's not raining out. And we get this massive amount of runoff. And that not only creates water quality issues, like we mentioned, but it creates a lot of flooding issues. And so if we can rethink how we're landscaping our properties and make them beneficial to nature and to water quality, it can be a very winning situation. And so this just kind of shows you, the solid line on this graph is how a stream would work in a more naturalized system. And the dotted line is the stream discharge that would happen after it's been developed. So we create much more flashy systems when that water is able to run over our landscape and into our storm sewer system than if we have a type of landscape where it can soak into the ground and we reduce the runoff. And then if we have that type of landscape, we also have the environmental benefits of it helping pollinators and other ecological species. So you can go from this, right, this big massive lawn with maybe a tree dotted here or there and a lot of mowing needs, which also creates lots of air pollution, to the happy, cheery gardening lady at the bottom, full of native plants that support pollinators, that have deep roots, that allow that water to get into the ground, that have more foliage than your grasses, that are going to grab that water and evaporate it back in the atmosphere and create a whole functioning system like would have been here before humans came and changed the landscape so drastically. So it's a multi-benefit situation, the more grass you remove and the more native plantings that you can put in. So it basically goes from being almost functioning as green asphalt to turning your lawn into a sponge, right? Just slowly soaking up that water and holding it on your land and putting it back into the ground where we really need it to go, so that we can have, water stored in the ground and water in our streams when it's not flowing out. And you can see the different root structures that can exist in a lot of these native plants, right? Obviously, tree roots are extensive, shrub roots are extensive, and native perennial roots can be extensive. And this creates pathways for that water to get into the ground it breaks up some of that compaction, and creates better soil systems than you do when you just have turf grass. And so the idea is that if we can, add pollinators to our yard, it's going to have really impressive water quality benefits overall for us and reduce some of that water leaving our properties, creating water quality issues. The other big thing is trees. There's many, many native trees and shrubs. Trees will absorb thousands and thousands of gallons of rainwater per year. They help get that water back into the ground. They help reduce runoff. If you live anywhere near a stream, there should be trees along a stream. We call that a riparian buffer. They're really important for maintaining the water temperature of streams. They're important for putting leaf litter into the streams, which creates habitat and food sources. And the roots hold the stream bank together. We can't have a healthy watershed unless we increase our canopy cover, and we can't really reduce our runoff unless we start to recreate that forested system. And so I know trees kind of get a bad rap sometimes because they can take down power lines and cause damage to property. So we need to ensure that it's the right tree for the right location. You're not going to put a giant oak tree under your power lines, but adding trees to properties and to parks is really essential to creating holistic habitats that function for people and for nature. So these are just a couple shots. Michelle and Anita are going to have massive amounts of photos about what they did, but this is a green street in the Delmont section of Lower Merion, and they decided they didn't want their front lawn anymore, and so the lawn was stripped off. There is some trees and shrubs at it and lots of native perennials. This is after it was first planted. So you can see those little landscape plugs are really tiny at first, but then it's going to fill in and look like this. So this landscape has many water quality benefits. It has many habitat benefits, and it creates a lot of beauty in the landscape. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing, right? Lawn is a very functional surface for people to have in their yards and to recreate on. This home took this big swath of lawn on the side of their house, and they just pushed these flower beds out and created a little walking path of lawn, but they added habitat and reduced the lawn area in a way that works for them and works for the way they're using their yard while reducing runoff from their property and increasing habitat value. So it doesn't, like I said, have to be an all or nothing. This is actually a rain garden. So this is taking runoff from the house, and it's actually depressed area, but it's also just planted in native plants. So the edge of your yard along the edge of the street is a great way to kind of increase habitat, reduce runoff, and a place where you're maybe not using lawn for anything. You can convert it into something useful. This is we're not going to judge the fact that this is weedy and the lawn needs to be cut. This is my yard. This is my side yard where that big pot is. That pot's full of native asters. There's a tree stump. The tree was old and it died, and I replaced it with this native fringe tree. But instead of just putting a tree in the grass, I created a little native pollinator garden around it. And so eventually the plan is to slowly kind of creep that out every year and make it a little bit bigger. But you don't just have to have a tree in the landscape surrounded by a little mulch ring. You can add pollinator habitat by just, creating, a 10 by 5 or 5 by 5 little pollinator garden and kind of spreading out from there. So it really creates a multifunctional system. Your yard, everyone has a yard. Everyone has grass, and a lot of the land in the United States of America is privately owned. And in order to improve water quality, in order to increase and create that habitat that we really need to get everyone engaged in converting over some of their property into something else that's beneficial for everyone and the environment. So that was my little spiel. I wanted to say that the Conservancy, the Stormwater Collaborative, DCVA, and PRC have some grant funding, and so we are able to offer free native plant plugs, which are like, they almost look like annuals, but they have really deep roots, the size of an annual, but they have really deep roots that are meant to go right in the soil. So we are going to offer those to participants of this workshop on these 2 days. They're going to be given out at Morton Borough Hall. I'm going to get everyone's email address who attended this workshop to send this information out. But everyone is welcome to come. It's first come, first served. There's a mix of shade, sun, different heights, and we usually say people can take like 20 or so to get started on their pollinator garden. So I'm going to pass it over to Michelle Detwiler, who is really awesome and knowledgeable about native plants, and she will take this away.
Okay, thank you so much, Jamie. That was wonderful. I'm really excited about your plant giveaway. I'm going to show some pictures of those native plant plugs so that people can see exactly what they look like and how they spread within the landscape. I'm a native planting designer, and so I'm used to helping people figure out how to transform their yards in terms of adding more habitat. So we're going to talk about different forms of grass removal today, a reminder about the wonderful pollinators that visit our spaces. And again, I'm going to talk to you about some specific native plants that we call keystone native plants, which are real powerhouses in terms of keeping our food webs going. And so I'd like to start in Kate's yard because Kate inspires me with her yard transformation, and I hope she'll inspire you as well. This is her photo of her children playing in her front yard in her native gardens underneath this beautiful red maple tree. One of her first projects was to introduce a rain garden in the front yard. This garden I designed for her. She got a landscaper to help scoop out the soil to create a sort of basin where water could be retained. And this took the place of a Japanese maple, which was not supporting wildlife in her space. The leaf chemistry of non-native trees generally doesn't support our insects or feed the birds. So she wanted something that would be both functional in terms of capturing that water, like Jamie emphasized, and also beautiful and supporting the food web. So you can see here in early June, the native milkweed is blooming, the penstemons are blooming, the violets are spreading on this berm, and the liatris will soon bloom later. It looked like this when we first started. You can see a shallow basin here. The downspouts enter the garden from about half of the roof right here. And then on the lower edge, there's something we call the berm, which is a raised area of soil which retains the water in this shallow basin behind it so that it can infiltrate, so that it can remove pollutants from the water and prevent the flooding and water quality issues that Jamie talked about. This is what the rain garden looks like in the winter right here. And Kate did not stop at introducing a rain garden. She and her husband have now removed all of the grass in their front yard. They've introduced this wonderful little path that their girls love to run around and experience in the landscape. And here you can see the area of further grass removal. So she's taken that rain garden and she's expanded it and removing all the grass around it. These are the native plant plugs that you will have access to. 20 is very, very generous. So you can see that they have deep roots, but they don't have a lot of soil or plastic around them. So they're sort of a great sustainable way to get started. And I encourage you to plant these quite closely together depending on the species. And the reason for that is because they will fill quickly and help with weed suppression going forward. So Kate is laying out her native sedges here, and every place that she has a flag marked is a space for another species that might be coming later that she's going to work in. Of course, she's assessing her sun and her shade conditions to determine where these plants will go. And they've put a couple of chairs in the front yard, and you can see how they are real thought and action leaders in their neighborhood. If you compare what they're doing in their space to the front yards of more traditional areas that just have the turf grass, which Jamie showed you that picture of, has very shallow roots. It doesn't have the deep roots of the native plants that allow infiltration and decompaction. Here's another view of that where you can really see the contrast in Kate's yard with her neighbors there. And her space is just a joy to experience. It is always full of insects, and her children play outside. They say, "Oh, do your children miss the grass?" Well, they don't. There's a lot of creative play within her space, even with the plants. And look at her daughter, Willa. This inspires me so much. I hope it brings a smile to your face too. She's laying on top of the native sedges, which didn't recover right away, but it's a reminder to all of us that we are part of nature. We should be experiencing our landscapes fully, enjoying them. We are part of the life that we are trying to also support around us. So there you see the diverse plantings under her trees, her children playing there. And you'll notice that she has plantings that flower blow all through the season. So on the left-hand side, she has foam flower and a native erigeron that's blooming in spring. And in that same area, she has white wood aster and blue stem goldenrod blooming in the fall. So it's a reminder that we can include a lot of diverse plantings within a small area to bring pollinator nutrients in the spring through all the way from early spring to late fall, and for beauty for us as well. She has New England asters, which are a great nectar source for migrating monarchs and the bees. She has wonderful vernonias and goldenrods, and then she leaves plants standing, the perennial plantings standing in the winter for beauty in the winter landscape. They sort of add an ethereal and a textural and a element to the landscape. They're also supporting native birds that are feeding on the seed heads in the winter, and the stem nesting bees that will be in the stems of those plants. Of course, insects is a large reason why we do the native plants, why we incorporate native plants. Here you see a beautiful crab spider camouflage with that chelone, that turtle head there. Here you see a monarch beginning to pupate, right here, monarch caterpillar. These are all in Kate space. And here you see an American lady butterfly laying her eggs on the leaves of a plant called pussy toes, our Antonaria species. It's a wonderful native ground cover for sunny areas, for rock gardens. The reason this mother is laying her eggs here is because when her eggs hatch into caterpillars, this is the only genus that they can eat. And we call that a host plant. And that's what makes our native plantings so powerful, is that they are hosting the caterpillars of species that are very specific about what they can eat. And those include our moths and our butterflies. And I'm going to talk to you more about that later. We have a tremendous number of pollinators, and I know you're probably like me in experiencing the joy and the awe, these small moments that we have as we enter our gardens and see the species come to the plants that we've provided for them. Of course, migrating monarchs and the beetles and flies and wasps and day flying and nighttime flying moths and the hummingbirds. Our native bees, which we have over 400 species of, are our most important daytime pollinators, and our moths, which we have over 350 species of, are important nighttime pollinators that we forget about. But the caterpillars of moths are what are really, really powerful in our spaces in feeding the rest of the food web. We largely don't see these on leaves, but the birds are using them to raise their young. And the birds are not necessarily very specific about which caterpillars they're eating often, but they need thousands of them to raise their broods. And we know that particularly our neotropical migrants would go extinct without the insects in our spaces. So we provide these native plants that are powerhouses for the caterpillars to feed our wrens and our nesting woodpeckers and our chickadees and all of the other birds that visit our spaces. We also recognize that we've really changed our landscapes dramatically by introducing a lot of plants that are causing harm to the environment, like these burning bush here. These look really beautiful to human eyes in the fall when they turn this pretty red color, but their leaves are not supporting the insects. And these are also escaping into our natural areas and taking the space that would otherwise be occupied by native plants that would feed the food web. So we recognize that plant choice really matters in our landscape. We've gone down a road that's been very damaging to the environment to this point, and we can do a lot to change that now. We recognize that the way we grow food has really changed the landscape. So in agricultural settings where we're growing annual species, we don't have a diversity of plants above ground supporting anything, and we don't have below ground diversity with different types of root systems, for example. We have expansive lawns for cultural and aesthetic reasons that are doing a lot of damage to the environment because of those short root systems and their inability to host insects, as Jamie spoke about. And a lot of what we've landscaped, as I mentioned, barberry shrubs, non-native dogwoods, non-native pear trees, non-native roses, these are not supporting our insect species. So we're here to understand how we can make a difference in our spaces. And we've had a lot of inspiration from people over the years. Aldo Leopold, of course, a naturalist who reminded us of the importance of the entire food web, including predators. Elsa Riemann, a landscape architect, and Edith Roberts, a botanist at Vassar, in the early 1900s wrote a book called American Plants for American Gardens. Already they were seeing that people were landscaping with non-native plantings, and they wanted to remind us about how beautiful our native plants were and how we could work them into the ecoregion where we lived, work them into our landscapes based on the ecoregion where we live. So we live in the eastern deciduous forest, we live in the northern Piedmont, and we can begin to put back the oaks and the hickories and the native dogwoods and the witch hazels and the spice bush that you would see in our forested areas. Lori Otto of Wild Ones was a big inspiration in suggesting that if we landscape suburbia with meadows and thickets and forests, we would have clean water and the birds would sing and human spirits would soar. I just got back from Central Texas. I visited the Wildflower Center there, and it's a big inspiration in Central Texas right now because all of the highways, as you're driving through, are lined with wildflowers. And this was largely the doing of Lady Bird Johnson, who was interested in beautifying the Texas highway system, but also in encouraging the use and protection of native plants across the country, wherever we are. Daryl Morrison, he's a wonderful landscape architect who's encouraged the um, the use of natural landscaping in design. And of course, Robin Wall Kimmerer reminding us of the relationship of Native Americans and the wisdom of Native Americans in teaching us about the relationships of people to plants and animals. And most recently, in addition to many others, is entomologist Doug Tallamy at the University of Delaware, who's taught us with his book, Bringing Nature Home, about the special relationship of those caterpillars with native plantings. And so his work has led to the formation of a project called Homegrown Habitat. And you can visit that website and you can get on the map with your property and you promise to incorporate native plants. His idea is that we convert half of our turf grass areas into native plantings and think of our spaces as important as we would spaces in national parks. So we're planting native, we're regenerating biodiversity, and biodiversity refers to the number of species of plants and animals in any one space. And incorporating more plants supports more animals, and you can take advantage of this by looking at your landscape and seeing where you have different niches. Where do you have dry spots? Where do you have wet spots? Where do you have slopes and shade and sun, and incorporate different plant species that will support different organisms in those areas. This is a map showing those that have signed up for the Homegrown Habitat Project. The darker the color on these states, the more people that have signed up. So I encourage you to visit that if you're interested in being part of a community, a larger community. And of course, we're doing this because we recognize that we need to put all these plants back down here at the bottom of the biomass pyramid. Ferns and shrubs and trees and grasses and perennials will feed those specialist insects that then feed the rest of the food web, our amphibians and our birds and our larger birds of prey, and ultimately us. If you can do anything on this list, you'll be making a big difference in your space. These are things that we need to avoid going forward for the environment. Expansive lawns, as we talked about, introduced species, the use of heavy wood mulch over and over and over. I view mulch as a temporary ground covering until plants fill in. And so if you can view it that way and begin to plant densely, you'll find that you'll have more plantings, you'll have more plants over time and more life in your space. If you can avoid ornamental lighting at night, this really confuses migrating birds. It also draws moths to these lights, and moths are a very important part of the food web. We should avoid removing what we consider traditionally to be debris, like our leaves and our dead wood. We really need our leaves and we really need dead wood for those microhabitats in our spaces. And we want to avoid pesticides as much as possible, lawn fertilizers and chemicals. And we want to avoid spraying for mosquitoes. It doesn't work very well to spray for adult mosquitoes, number one. And also you'll be killing most of the insects in your space when you do that. So we certainly don't want to plant native plants and then accidentally kill them all by spraying large scale pesticides like that. This was my front space when we first moved in. It had sort of a non-native invasive species here and a few other things that weren't providing a lot for the environment. So I just put the plants back. Of course, I assessed the situation. It's a sunny sloped edge. It's a little bit harsh. It's right on the road. So I put a dry site aster. I put aromatic aster. I put low growth sumac. I put winterberry and many other species. And then I allow some of the naturally occurring species to come in, like this spice bush. This seeded itself in from the birds probably. I let it grow to maturity. You can see how beautiful it is in the fall. I let the American holly come in. I added some sumac. Just had a lot of fun bringing to life what I consider a conservation landscape. I didn't want lawn in my front yard, and so I hope that's some inspiration for you. When I'm helping clients, I often recommend identifying a site where you want to remove grass. Maybe you put up flags, maybe you lay out a hose to see what the area might look like and imagine removing grass there and then plan for plantings based on the sun conditions. This is a good place to start is under young trees, for example. We call this space a soft landing because it's providing for the insects that use the leaves in the growing season in the soil beneath them. So soft landings basically are supporting all the insects using the leaves. If you plant under an oak tree, for example, these are the species that would be using that oak tree, the leaves in the growing season, the red-banded hairstreak, the Luna moth, the great dagger moth. But later generations in the summer and into the fall are going to complete their life cycle in the ground. They're going to fall from the tree into the ground, and they're going to need a soft place to overwinter, beneath leaves, beneath soft plantings. It's difficult for them to overwinter in the grass because it's a compacted area, as Jamie mentioned. The roots are not very deep, and it's difficult to overwinter if there's no cover, if there are no leaves or soft organic matter to temper the soil, the changing soil temperatures through the winter. So if you provide a soft landing, which is plantings under a native tree, those insects can safely overwinter beneath it and then emerge the next season without risk of being killed by a lawnmower um, or or compaction from walking on them, for example. So this graphic over here is a reminder to not mow right underneath trees and to not put landscape fabric down. As you can imagine, landscape fabric is going to keep all of those insects from burrowing into the soil and overwintering. It also contains a tremendous number of microplastics that will shed off into the watershed, and it's not very effective for very long anyway. So I encourage you not to use landscape fabric. So back to our soft landing here under these three trees where we have the flags laid out. After you lay out your flags, you can begin to remove the grass there. In this case, Durante Landscaping helped us here. They removed the grass, and then we installed grasses, shrubs, and flowering perennials in spring, summer, and fall. We kept it fairly simple, but we used a diversity of those things. So it creates a layered planting underneath these trees. If you'd like to remove the grass yourself, you can use a flat shovel. That's a pretty easy way to do it. Any shovel will work, the flatter, the easier. This is Michael Durante of Durante Landscaping. You can see how he just gets parallel with the ground and works underneath the roots of the grass. It does generate quite a bit of organic matter, so you'll need a tarp or a wheelbarrow to haul it off, and I encourage you to compost this on site. And you'll notice as we talk about different forms of grass removal that they all have pros and cons, and you might weigh those for yourself based on your circumstances. Here we are expanding a rain garden by removing grass to create even more planting area within the lawn. This is another example of a soft landing where we planted underneath an oak tree. And of course, under an oak tree is the most valuable place to plant because this is our most valuable wildlife tree in terms of how many insects it can support. So there used to be just turf grass underneath there. Then we removed the grass and we put in beautiful woodland plantings that can tolerate the shade of that tree. So we have woodland phlox and tiarella, our foam flower. There's some woodland poppy, and native columbine. There are native sedges and mayapple. And the idea is that these will both spread through rhizomes and also reseed to fill holes over time so that no mulch will be needed in this space. And all those insects that fall in late summer and fall will be able to overwinter safely without being run over by a lawnmower, for example. It also adds just a beautiful spot in the yard. This is an example of a group working together on a volunteer basis, a scout troop, to remove grass at a local church for an Eagle Scout project. So they're using their regular shovels, they're getting underneath there, they're turning it over, they're hauling that off for compost. I inserted this slide to remind myself to tell you that you do want to know what species are in your grass. Often, if you're not spraying chemicals on your grass, you'll have a diversity of things, which is usually fine. So you can see grass right here. But often there's one plant that gives me pause, and I've had a lot of hard lessons recently. So I want to tell you, this is lesser celandine. It has little heart-shaped leaves. It comes out in the very, very late winter, early spring, and has little yellow flowers. When you scrape off the grass with your shovel, you're likely not going to remove the lesser celandine. And lesser celandine goes away after the spring. Once it gets hot, it puts all of its energy back into the ground and you cannot see the leaves anymore. So if you remove the grass in the summer or the fall, you may not know this is there. So I encourage you to know if it's there and to plan your plantings accordingly. This will not grow very well with a lot of perennials. Perennials, it will smother perennials if it comes up the next year. It's very, very frustrating. So I encourage you to plant trees and shrubs with lesser celandine if you have a very, very large patch of it, or to deal with this in advance before you expect to plant a diversity of perennials. So that's lesser celandine. Back to the church project, this is what it looks like in progress. They removed the grass. We put in a lot of native plantings and they mulch it, again, a temporary mulch to keep the water from evaporating, moisture from evaporating from the soil and keep the weeds down until those plants can fill in. And this is what it looked like the next spring as the columbine's blooming and the golden ragwort is beginning to bloom. This is a residential project where the homeowner wanted to create a wonderful border of native plantings at the front of her yard. And you can see again how she's a thought leader in her neighborhood as well, because nearby properties are doing a more traditional landscape with just turf grass. But she wasn't using this turf grass here, so it was a good space for it. The landscaper removed the grass for us. We planted those plugs, a lot of them the size that you'll be getting if you choose to take advantage of the giveaway. And in a sunny spot, they can often grow very quickly. So later that fall, this is what that garden looked like, if you'll believe it or not. And these are asters over here. These are Rudbeckia species. These are native grasses, little blue stem in here. You can see our orange milkweed has already gone to seed and has those wonderful seed heads. And here's some goldenrod. So it's a beautiful front yard, sort of prairie style planting that draws a lot of interest from the neighbors. And of course, the homeowner enjoys going out to see the birds and the butterflies and the bees here. This is another residential property. This is an example of a large scale transformation. I encourage you to do any size transformation whatsoever, because even a single plant is very, very helpful. But this was a large one. And so a crew did remove this by hand. Again, it generates a lot of organic matter, but the benefit of doing it this way is that you can plant right away. So you can remove the grass and you can plant right away. And this is what that landscape looked like in the first year. I did large swaths of the same species so it would look intentional to passersby, but I included a diversity. I included 3 native trees over here and another native tree over here, in addition to shrubs and perennials. Here's wild bergamot and our native milkweed and some liatris. In the fall, it transitions to a big sweep of that aromatic aster that I really like. And then the fall color of Virginia sweet spire shows through underneath those native trees there. This is another example of how to remove grass with a sod cutter. I would say it's not my favorite tool. Sometimes, a lot of times the machines don't work very well. I don't necessarily encourage you to rent one yourself, but some landscapers do use them. And the benefit is that it cuts the sod off quickly. It still has to be hauled away, but again, you can plant right away. And so this homeowner wanted to remove the grass on a slope. And this is a great place to remove grass because you're not playing Frisbee here. It's very hard to recreate here and it's not much to look at and it's very difficult to mow. So slopes are great places to incorporate native plantings. She also had the non-native privet removed up here. And this is what it looks like in process once the grass is removed. I lay out all the plants. These are the size of those deep landscape plugs that you'll be receiving. And it looked like this the next year. So again, native milkweeds, which I always try to include. These are native St. John's wort shrubs. The wild bergamot is about to bloom. A diversity of species. We also included a little grove of trees over here, a white oak and some dogwoods and a couple of hawthorns. So it's possible to have a major transformation if you think about the difference in this and that turf grass that was there before. On the other side of her property, we also removed the grass and created a pathway. I wanted to show you this so you could see the pathway because often our yards become experiential when we make these transformations. We become part of nature. She takes her dogs out. They walk twice a day. They look at the wildlife. They see how the plants are changing. And you can do this with a simple pathway in your space too. A simpler or smaller scale way to remove grass is just to do it incrementally over time. So this is my front space in front of my garage. And I'd already taken out the non-native plantings and replaced them with natives, but I wanted to expand the bed. So in my free time, I would remove small sections of grass. That's why this looks less vegetated in the front. I wanted to expand this bed forward. So this is something you can do too. If you have an existing bed, just expand it, and where you expand, you add native plantings. I included both live native plants that I put in, and then I also allow the existing native plantings to reseed and to spread into this space. So this is what it looked like later in early June here. And of course, I love plants. So you can see the diversity of things that I include in my space. And there are different ways to approach this. You don't have to do it this way, but I enjoy the plants, so I do it this way. And then later in the season, I have sunflowers and tall native thistles and Joe Pye weeds and so forth that fill in later on. So I've had a lot of fun removing grass in my space and expanding beds. This is another idea for removing grass and incorporating beds. This homeowner wanted to do island beds that are sort of just within the lawn and retain grass pathways where he could still walk. So there are 3 new beds, one here, and one here. And the way he removed grass in this space was he shoveled it himself and he flipped it over in place. So you can do this if you have the benefit of time on your side. He did this in the fall. He took his shovel, he got under the grass roots, flipped it over with a good amount of soil on those roots. It works better if you have more soil on the roots. And then he piled leaves on top of it. And this is in the fall. And he allowed the grass to decompose in place. And the benefit of this is he did not have to haul away the heavy sod to compost somewhere else. It could decompose right in place. And so in the spring, with the benefit of the winter, this is what it looked like. Now, if he noticed that the grass began to reroot, even though it was flipped over, he would go out in the winter and just flip it over again and put more leaves on top. But you can see why this is a sustainable way to do this if you give yourself enough time to prepare it yourself. So this is a fall to spring transition. And then we lay out the native plantings quite densely again so they fill quickly. And by the next year, this is what that front island bed looks like. It has native asters and goldenrods, native iris, some Joe Pye weed, and we echoed some of the same species in the back beds there, but there's space to maintain the beds by walking around and experience them also that way. Another way to remove grass is to smother it. And this is by using cardboard that you take the tape off of, ideally not printed cardboard. There are some pros and cons to this, but it is a very easy way to do a small space, and a lot of people do it, so I want to mention it. You do have to weigh it down because it will blow away right away. It doesn't work very well on slopes because it's difficult to anchor it down, and I don't recommend using it for the long term as a mulch because there are some unknowns with cardboard in terms of the chemicals that they might have in them. I'm not an expert on the chemicals in cardboard, so that's why I hesitate on this. And there aren't a lot of studies that help demonstrate if chemicals are leaching from the cardboard into the soil. So that's just a caveat I tell you because I'm a science-minded person. I want you to have all the information. But it is a quick way of smothering the grass because, as you know, you don't have to cover grass long for it to die. The benefit is that you don't have to shovel anything and you don't have to haul anything away. The drawback is that it doesn't allow oxygen into the soil, which is really important for soil health and for the microorganisms in the soil. So it's one reason why I hesitate to suggest that it be used on a large scale. But I think that as a temporary measure, it can be quite useful. So you can look into it yourself if you'd like. This is another example of smothering an area. This is a swale that was created by another landscaper in order to intercept water coming off this residence landscape. So the water's coming from this hill into this area, and she wanted to keep it from moving to her house foundation. So the landscaper dug a trough here to encourage the water to go this way. But when I saw it, I said, well, really, you should vegetate that. You should plant it so that the plants can slow the water and allow it to infiltrate before it just rushes off. So she smothered it with cardboard here and it was planted up. This is what a swale can look like. This is in a different location. This is at the near the Haverford Reserve where they did this wonderful swale project, but I wanted to show you what it can look like. So the water is coming crosswise to the swale, perpendicular, and then these wonderful plants like obedient plant and switch grasses can intercept that water here that's in that swale. This is another example of a homeowner that used cardboard and some mulch and chips to help smother the species that were in place. And then if the cardboard was not broken down, she removed it before planting. We laid out the plants, and it again was a very dense planting. She left a pathway for grass for walking and experiencing it, but she removed all the turf that was not being used for recreation. You might have heard of this method of grass removal, which is with the use of plastic. I don't necessarily recommend this. If you use black plastic, it's called smothering. If you use clear plastic, it's called solarization. There's a big carbon footprint to plastic production, so I do not recommend buying plastic to do this. If you happen to have it, maybe you'd be okay. But these homeowners were trying to prevent invasive vines from coming back that they had just removed in this space. So as a temporary covering, it's not terrible, but it's probably not great for microplastics in the watershed. And it's not going to allow oxygen and water into the soil, which is really important for the microorganisms beneath the soil. So one of the best ways to smother grass is to use arborist wood chips. And those are what you can see here in this picture. They're non-dyed uh, wood chips of whole trees. They take the whole tree and chip the whole thing. So in this case, a homeowner had a dead tree on her property. She left a nice size wildlife snag, a 10-foot snag for wildlife. And then the rest of it she had chipped and put on her property. So if you have that happening on your property, you can ask them to leave the wood chips in place to smother the grass that's here. In this case, there were a lot of invasive species, shrubs that were removed, and this was an attempt to keep those down. If you want to smother grass with this, you need to put 8 to 12 inches of wood chips over mowed grass. So you mow it down, you put 8 to 12 inches of wood chips, and then you wait a couple of weeks for the grass to die beneath the wood chips. The benefit of this is that it allows oxygen and water into the soil but keeps light from getting in. So it's the best for the microorganisms in the soil. It's the best approach to grass removal. Here we were creating a rain garden, which looked like this later on to intercept some of the water from this homeowner's property. This is what a dump of arborist wood chips looks like. If you request one, you can request it from a local arborist. If you already have a relationship with them, they'll often do that for you. You tell them how many yards you want. You can use an online yard calculator, cubic yard calculator, to determine how much you need, and you would put in an 8 to 12 inch depth. And then you would need to move these into place, or pay somebody to help you move these into place in order to smother an area. And this is an approach recommended by Linda Chalker Scott, who is a professor and horticultural extension agent out west. And I encourage you to visit her website if you're interested in this approach. It's gardenprofessors.com. And this is her favorite and most recommended way for getting rid of grassy areas. Mow it short, cover it with wood chips, wait, and plant through the wood chips. You do not want the wood chips to enter your planting hole, so you pull back the chips, you plant your plants flush with the soil, and then you put the chips back over the disturbed area, but you never put the wood chips actually in the hole, nor do you add amendments. And so that's one approach. This is a homeowner that did just that. They used wood chips from the township transfer station and smothered their lawn right here. Then they removed some of the chips in order to be able to seed, because you need good seed soil contact if you're going to use seed. But then she left them up here where she could plant live plants right through those. So it is effective, and you can do it that way. You can also use wood chips to expand existing beds, like this homeowner is doing here. He has lots of asters and goldenrods, and he's mulching with the wood chips and expanding the beds. This is my front space, and sometimes you don't have to remove grass in order to incorporate native plantings. There are other opportunities. In my case, I removed a lot of non-native hostas that were here, because they weren't providing for wildlife like I really wanted in my space. So I removed the non-natives. I replaced them with golden ragwort, which is an early flowering native ground cover. I replaced them with foam flower and white violets on this side, and phacelia. I have native columbine in there. And I allow all of the leaves to stay in my space in the fall because it adds a sense of seasonality. It's what I expect of fall, and it's providing that cover in those soft landings that we talked about underneath the trees and shrubs. And then in the winter, because I plant with a diversity of trees and shrubs and perennials, and I leave those things standing, the snow highlights the structure in the winter and adds beauty even in the winter garden. Other opportunities to landscape with native plantings include putting them in where you've had disturbance, soil disturbance. In this case, this homeowner had more construction disturbance of the soil than she expected. They were going to reseed it with grass, and I said, why don't we just plant it with native plants instead? So if you have to have plumbing work done outside or an electrical line, something dug up outside where you have soil disturbance, you might consider this in your space too. And because I noticed that the water was really running off the landscape here, I suggested that we do a rain garden. So we scooped out the soil here to create that sort of basin to retain the water, which you can see really well before it's planted. And then on the downhill side is a raised berm to hold that water in, keep it from running off into the watershed and the neighbor's property. And then we planted it up here. And so in the center of the rain garden, I put plants that can tolerate both flooding and drought, like soft rush and blue flag iris and some of our native elderberries. And then I picked plantings for sun at the top of the slope and for shade at the bottom of the slope and covered it very densely, as you can see. This is another rain garden. This one happens to be in New Jersey. The homeowners were interested in removing their lawn to do native plantings and pathways. So the downspout here from the front half of the roof enters the rain garden right here. So when it rains, the water pours into this shallow basin. Here's our berm at the end of it that retains that water. And in this case, I planted a river birch and native switchgrasses, northern bayberry, and some Amsonia in the center of this flood zone. And then on the berm, I planted dry site mints and dry site asters. And this is what it looked like later in the year. So my goal is to cover the entire ground again with the planting so that very little mulch needs to be applied later on. And of course, the homeowners love the experience in their space and knowing that this is functional for retaining that water in addition to being beautiful. This is another rain garden. This is a quite large one. They were doing renovations on this house. They don't use this area of grass for recreation. So we had a large basin dug out here, and this is what it looked like the next spring. There's a big, big basin right here. There's a berm on this side. On the dry site berm on the berm that tends to be somewhat dry and well drained, we put aromatic aster and native sedges and our round leaf ragwort. That's the yellow blooming species there. And then in the center, we have Amsonia and clethra and rushes and sedges. And it's just a beautiful experience for the homeowners, in addition to capturing that water from the entire roof of this building, which comes down 2 downspouts and enters the garden on this side. Sometimes just replacing front non-native plantings with native plantings can be a lot of fun, and that's what we did in this space. We didn't have to remove grass, we just removed the non-native plantings. And so in spring it looks like this, with moss phlox and our Father Gillis shrubs blooming and our native sedges starting to green up. And then in summer, the Joe Pye weeds and the Rudbeckia fill in, and in fall, the native asters and goldenrods really shine. And this becomes an experience for both the homeowners and their visitors as they enter the house. This was another opportunity with construction where the soil was just already disturbed, that we could put the plants back and pick some ones that make sense for the food web. So here we included Penstemon hirsutus, which is a native penstemon, which blooms in the spring, followed by a summer blooming red monarda, our red bee balm here, which the hummingbirds visit all summer long. And so this is a beautiful, lush landscape for wildlife. And these homeowners lost their front yard landscaping to a tree that fell in this space. So we didn't have to remove grass. Again, another opportunity to include native plantings. They look small when they start, but they grow quickly. It fills in. There's beautiful Vernonias now, and Joe Pye weeds, and a shrub dogwood, a serviceberry on this side. And here are the asters shining in the fall in this front yard native garden. So I want to tell you now about some really important native plants. And the reason they're important is because they're supporting the caterpillars and the bees. So just like monarch caterpillars can only use milkweed as a source of food for their caterpillars, many other butterflies and moths can only use other native plants for their caterpillars. So these are question mark and comma butterflies that can only use nettle family plants. In addition to caterpillars that are specific about what they eat, we have native bees that are very specific about the pollen that they eat. So this is an aster specialist bee that only eats the pollen from aster plants. And we have a number of those. And so by planting species that can feed the specialist bees, we also support the generalist bees and keep biodiversity high in our spaces. This is another native bee, a bellflower bee, that prefers the resin from our native bellflower, for example. And of course, all of these insects are feeding the birds and the rest of the food web. We have 437 native bee species and 350 native moth species. Keystone plants refer to the plants that I mentioned that are supporting the most caterpillars and also specialist bees. So there were sort of two categories of keystone plants based on this definition that's really defined by Doug Tallamy's work. The idea is that this rosy maple moth needs a maple plant to lay her eggs on because those eggs hatch and become caterpillars, and these caterpillars can only eat these leaves. When the next generation, when that pupates in the soil, it becomes another rosy maple moth. And the cycle continues. What Doug Tallamy and his colleagues learned when they looked across the United States was that only 14%, a small number of native plants, were supporting a majority of the caterpillar species, the Lepidoptera, the caterpillars of moths and butterflies. So just a few native plants are supporting the majority of the food web. And what Doug Tallamy's research basically shows is if you can count the number of moth species in your space, you have a good idea of how resilient and how biodiverse your space is. It's a very interesting metric that way. So if you include keystone native species in your space, you'll have lots of caterpillars. If you don't include a lot of keystone species, you will have very few. And the more caterpillars you have, the more birds that can nest in your space, for example. So how do you determine which plants are the most valuable to include? Well, you can visit the National Wildlife Federation. They have a native plant finder. And you click on native plants, you put in your zip code, and it will generate a list for you ranked on the most important plants to caterpillars in particular. So I've done that for you. If you're interested, I welcome you to take a screenshot of this. What it shows are the species that are most valuable in order. So the oaks are most important to caterpillars because they support 519 species of those. Our native prunus, our plums and cherries, are the next most important, and then our willows and birches and poplars and our native maples and so forth. The fourth column here shows you the number of specialist bees that use the pollen from these species. One thing you'll notice is that the most important wildlife plants are trees and shrubs in our area. The vast majority, they're what's really keeping the food web going. But on the other hand, we have some really powerful perennial plants like asters and goldenrods and strawberries. Asters and goldenrods in particular are supporting the most specialist bees compared to the woody species. So there's some complexity here, but one thing they've noticed about the specialist bees is that if you take the pollen away from them that they specialize on, they will stop their nesting activities. So again, we're encouraged to include the species for the caterpillars and for the bees. This is another way of looking at it. The oaks are supporting the most caterpillars, and then our cherries and willows and birches. And you'll notice that even though, for example, the tulip tree is a native tree, it's supporting fewer caterpillars than our oak trees. So if you have a choice between putting an oak and a tulip tree in your space, for example, you might choose the oak because it's supporting the food web in a much more robust way than a tulip tree, for example. And then a Norway maple down here is an example of a non-native tree, and you can see how little it's contributing to the food web because the insects just can't use the leaves, the foliage of that plant. This is another cheat sheet that I encourage you to take a screenshot of if it's helpful to you. These are our really important keystone species, not all of them, but some of the top ones for our area. They include the white oak family, white oak, swamp white oak, chestnut oak, the cherries here, pussy willow, a couple of birches, and some dogwoods down here. There's also a row of goldenrods and asters and sunflowers. We have perennial sunflowers and the Rudbeckia species, particularly for specialist bees. So I'll tell you about just a couple of those. There's so much information to give you, but I'll give you a start with a couple of these, and then I'll wrap up. So Quercus are our oaks. They're supporting 519 caterpillar species. This is an example of a soft landing under a red oak at Laurel Hill Cemetery. Look how beautiful that is. Imagine all those caterpillars that can safely overwinter there. We have black oaks and white oaks and red oaks. We have two families, red oak family and white oak family. The white oak family tends to be more resistant to disease right now, so I often recommend planting that one. It can have very pretty fall color depending on the individual tree. And so they're a lot of fun to put in our spaces, and I work them in wherever I can, often 3 at a time, so that the root systems can knit together as they grow together. Prunus are our cherries and plums. They support hundreds of caterpillars also. This is black cherry, Prunus serotina. This will often introduce itself into your space just through reseeding from the birds. So I encourage you to use a plant app to understand what trees, saplings might be coming up naturally in your space, and view those as gifts of nature, because they often are. So the foliage of this tree is what makes it so valuable to caterpillars, but it also has these beautiful racemes of flowers for the pollinators in the spring, and then small berries for the birds. If you have a smaller landscape, you can still incorporate prunus species, including American plum, which is a delightful small tree. It is really, really lovely. You often can't find them very big, so you might introduce them small, and they bloom very early and provide really nice pollen for queen bumblebees who are just getting their nests started after emerging from the soil in winter. Chokecherry, Prunus virginiana, is also a small prunus species that's very, very valuable in the environment, and you can incorporate into a smaller landscape. Birches are also really important to the food web. They support 381 caterpillars. You might know these species already. River birch, Betula nigra. You can see how much water a river birch can take. It's a beautiful tree with that peeling bark, and again, the foliage is supporting all those caterpillars. A more dry site birch is gray birch, Betula populifolia. It has those wonderful pendulous leaves that we all love so much, and the bark will get whiter over time, not like the northern white birch, but this is more adapted, more native to our area, and is a lovely small tree to provide for the food web. We also have dogwood species, both trees and shrubs. These also support native bees, so they're good to include in the landscape. Keep planting our eastern dogwoods. Keep encouraging them to pop up. They're just so incredibly valuable. They have those beautiful flowers right now that make our area just a delight to drive through. They support the specialist bees. They host our spring azure butterflies. They have wonderful both protein and fat-rich berries that mature right as the migrating birds fly through. So they're a really important source of food for migrating birds. And of course, they have that beautiful fall color for us. So these are the top, we just talked about woody species. And now I want to tell you a little bit about some herbaceous plants, the plants that die back to the ground in the winter, but their roots are still alive, so they flush later on, like our coneflowers and our geraniums and things like that. They don't have persistent woody material above ground, but they're still alive in a perennial sense. And some of our most important ones are goldenrods, asters, strawberries, and sunflowers, because they're supporting the most caterpillars. And you'll notice over here, they're also supporting a lot of specialist bees to keep diversity high in our spaces. So there are a lot of different kinds of goldenrods, our solidagos, but I'm going to tell you about two. One is a sun-loving species, which is wrinkle leaf goldenrod. It works easily into the landscape. It's just a beautiful vase-shaped 3 to 4 foot plant. Here you can see it at the Mount Cuba Center, worked in with some shorter native grasses and native asters and summer phlox. It supports and it supports lots of bees, so it'll bring lots of color to the late season landscape, as you can see here. This is an example of the goldenrod, asters, and sunflowers. So this is a great keystone native planting of perennial plants. This is a shade-tolerant goldenrod. This is called zigzag goldenrod. If you have a moist, shady space, this spreads really, really nicely as a ground cover. So it's an example of even a goldenrod for shade. Our asters support 115 caterpillar species. I love smooth blue aster. That's here. I work it in right around my sitting area because I come outside a lot. You can tell how much I love the plants and want to see the life around me. This one is called bluebird, but I encourage you to plant the species as well. It blooms before aromatic aster, which I'll also show you, and there is just so much bee activity on this plant in the fall. They're mating the new queen before the entire brood dies, and then the queen, if she gets good nutrients, will successfully overwinter by herself to start the next bumblebee brood for the next year. So I really like smooth blue aster. It does well in a dry site with sun. This is aromatic aster that I included on a lot of my slides because I put it in every design. I really like it for average or dry soils. It's very deer resistant. It's somewhat shapely, so it's readable to a lot of people, and it blooms very late in October. So it's a great source of nectar and pollen for late season pollinators. Here it is again in the garden I showed you previously, in that island garden and in the prairie style garden. This happens to be the species that I planted here. And here it is in comparison with New England aster. So you can see how New England aster gets a little bit tall. It tends to lose its leaves. It looks a little lanky. And the aromatic aster stays a little bit more shapely and lower. New England aster is also wonderful. It blooms before aromatic aster and can take more moisture in the soil. So it's good for those conditions. And this is an aster for shade, the blue wood aster, Symphytrichum cordifolium. You can see it here in this soft landing underneath this pine tree at one of our local parks. Draws lots of pollinators, even though it's in the shade. And of course, the foliage is providing for the caterpillars. So this is just a summary of what we've talked about. We've talked about ways to incorporate native plants by planting under trees, creating those soft landings, removing grass in unused areas like on slopes. We've talked about expanding existing beds and creating rain gardens and swales, replacing non-native species that maybe aren't providing for the environment or are doing damage to native or to more natural areas. And we've talked about revegetating disturbed areas that might pop up in our spaces. We also discussed non-chemical grass removal, ways of grass removal, including by hand with a flat shovel, with arborist wood chips, a good layer of those, and by smothering. And we've talked about the importance of plant choice, including those native keystone species. If you can incorporate those first, you'll be doing a lot of good in terms of moving your space in the right direction. And of course, we do it for the joy and the awe of seeing those beautiful pollinators, for the beauty, the habitat biodiversity, the watershed health that Jamie talked about, and for climate resilience. So I leave you with my presentation with a few resources that I encourage you to screenshot if you're interested. The Native Plant Finder, a website about the native bee specialists, Heather Holmes' website. I encourage you to follow Heather Holmes. She's a wonderful pollinator expert. I encourage you to visit the Mount Cuba Center to see native plants in the built landscape. They have a lot of great examples there. Here's Homegrown National Park if you'd like to join the map. And my website is wildaboutnativeplants.com with lots of lists and ways to search for native plants for your space if you need those. And my email is wildaboutnativeplants@gmail.com. And I thank you very much for having me today.
Great. And I'd like to invite Anita Eng and Christy to talk about what's going on locally in Havertown.
All right, so I'm Anita Eng. I'm here as one of the representatives from the Coopertown Beautification Crew, which is just a small grassroots organization to get people to plant more pollinators and more natives in our neighborhood. And I'm a mom. I live in the Coopertown neighborhood. I have 2 kids. My husband and I both work. We're not professionals in any way in this regard, but nonetheless, we've gotten a lot done. And Christy's going to introduce herself. She's my co-conspirator tonight.
Hi there. Yeah, my name's Christy Lang Hurlson. I likewise live in the Coopertown neighborhood, which is the close to Bryn Mawr Hospital if you're looking for the neighborhood. And yeah, I likewise work full-time, have 2 children, and am not a professional gardener, but have learned a whole lot through this process. And we're excited to tell you about our story. Do you want me to jump in here, Anita?
Yeah, it's
Okay.
all you.
So that's my yard there in the front, which has a mix of non-native and native plants there. But when we moved in, it was all non-natives. And over the course of several years, I had gotten more interested in native plant gardening and planting for pollinators, and was just loving the experience, and had learned the term green desert that describes a neighborhood that looks very green, but doesn't provide food or resources or habitat to our fellow creatures. And so I was walking around our neighborhood and just started thinking, what if we became a butterfly highway? What if this whole neighborhood could become a better habitat? And Anita, do you want to just say briefly kind of what you had been up to?
Yeah, I mean, I had actually, because of talks like the ones you guys just heard, had become inspired to try to move toward more natives in my yard, but also to try to figure out what I had in my yard and whether or not it was native to begin with or not, and what I should, keep, what I should get rid of, and should I be pulling out grass to get some more things in there that can really help, absorb more water into the soil, like Jamie talked about.
So we're going to show a slide next that shows where we are today, and then we'll tell you a little more about how we got there. So here's a map of our neighborhood, and today we have 15 pollination stations, Coopertown pollination stations. So these are small gardens that are designed to be pollinator gardens. And so we went from really nothing to having a neighborhood movement that is still unfolding, and we'll tell you how we got there. So we started with 3, or this is you, Anita, go ahead.
No, this is you.
This is me. Okay. We started with 3 interested households with our children, thinking it would be exciting if our neighborhood could change, not just our individual lawns, but we wanted to figure out how can you start a local movement? How can you get people excited about this? So the great thing is that we had adults and kids with different strengths and skills who met together. Anita is the most organized person I've ever met. And I like to walk around thinking about ideas like butterfly highways. And our friend Kelly here is incredibly social and talks to everybody. And our kids are all tremendously creative. And so we met together. The kids picked the name, the Coopertown Beautification Crew. We developed a mission statement to develop pollinator gardens in our neighborhood and a plan of action. So we thought through some of these questions here about how to articulate vision, track details, communicate, and promote the conversation.
So the first year was kind of our year of experiment. So actually first, Christy researched to find out whether or not we could actually plant something other than grass in that strip that's between the sidewalk and the street, which in our neighborhood, like all the houses have that. And everywhere you see in our neighborhood is just solid grass in that area. And so we were wondering, could we use that space to put pollinators in to kind of bring this movement to the forefront so people would really see it? And so it turns out in Hartford Township, you absolutely can plant that space. And then question number 2 was, well, if we try to plant things there, will they actually do well? Will they grow? Or, will the soil be bad? Like, we just didn't know what was going to happen. So 3 households, Christy, myself, and Kelly, we all went out there and dug out part of our, front yard. And Kelly and I did it on the verge and put in a bunch of pollinator plants to see how they went. And also then sort of as we did that process, thought about, okay, well, like, what should we have? We'd like to have a little sign that says pollination station and like, what should be the requirements? We wanted to make it like easy and achievable for people, but also really making a meaningful difference in our landscape. And so the criteria we came up with was like, you need to have at least 5 pollinator supporting plants and as many native plants as possible, and it needs to be visible from the street. We started very small, like with really small plots, because this is something homeowners can achieve and we can help them achieve in like in a short amount of time, like basically 1 day of planting. So in general, we just did really basic process here with the homeowners, and basically you choose a spot, you select plants based on shade, sun, think wet, dry, and then remove the grass. We have been mixing in topsoil and compost. I know that was one of the questions that came through on the chat. I'd be interested to hear, of course, what Michelle has to say about that. But we've been trying to mix in a bit of that, depending on how the soil looks. Honestly, it's really fascinating. Some places in the verge in our neighborhood, it doesn't seem to need much, just a little compost. Other places, it's really dense, clumpy clay, and so we have been mixing in more topsoil in those places, just so that the plants can really get their roots going down and don't kind of languish out in that spot. And also, it's on our verges. Often it's very sunny, like they're completely surrounded by sidewalk and asphalt. So like it can be a very sunny, hot place. So, focusing on planting things that are appropriate for that setting, but also breaking up the clay so that the water can really get in and sink in deep there. And then, of course, put in the plants, water the plants heavily when you put them in, put in some mulch on top or some leaf litter, and then just weed and water and watch and repeat. So the simple process is what we've been telling homeowners to do, just to try to make it seem really accessible, really feasible. And then, of course, this is Kelly's on her verge. Actually, what she did, you can see she just started with this little 4x4. She went this process, and then a month and a half later, you've got this beautiful space, and she's got even like a pumpkin in there, which is like spreading across, and she's got a little bird bath in there. So it's become this like little miniature wildlife space, right in the middle of this vast green swath of grass, just solid grass everywhere else. So in that first year, we learned a lot of things about just how to make this feasible. Removing sod is really hard work. So Michelle talked about all those great methods. We have not tried most of those methods. We've mostly done the one where you just like dig it out. But we found certain tools are make that easier. So like this is called like a radial edger. I think this tool I have shown here on the right is something we really like to make nice cuts around the edges. I know someone was talking about, do you have grass encroaching into your plantings? And in my experience, yes. And this tool is also really good for that. Every spring, I go in and I just redo my edges. I basically slice where I want the edge of the bed to be, or remind the world where I want the edge of the bed to be, and then I pull out the grass, that's on the wrong side. And then, of course, we use the sod as well. Sometimes, it's great to compost in place, but sometimes homeowners have little spots elsewhere in their property where it's gotten a little bare, or there's been a little flood, or they want to have some coverage. So actually, having the homeowner identify where they might want to move that sod, maybe under the swing set has gotten a little bare, but you can put, now you've got a chunk of sod you can put there. So you don't have to compost all of it, so you don't have to deal with all of it, because it is an issue. You pull up these chunks of sod, there's a lot of great topsoil and earthworms attached to the root system of the sod, and sort of whacking that off so that you reclaim all those nutrients and all those earthworms is really important, but it's also a lot of work. And then, of course, we've identified some of our favorite native suppliers. So that was another question somebody had in the chat. So we really like most Starties. They have a native section. You have to just, look at the labels and make sure you get the natives. And then Redbud, of course, is all native plants there. It's in media. We sometimes find things at other places, even Home Depot and Lowe's. But to do that, you kind of really have to know what you're looking for, because they usually won't have them labeled as native. And so we've been using apps like Picture This to just actually, even in the store, like identify, is this actually a native species? And so that's been like a really steep learning curve. I don't think any of those apps are perfect. I don't know if every scientist would agree with every one of them, but it at least gives you an idea. And then we also learned that it helps, like, since we're amending the soil, sometimes it ends up being a little higher than the grass around it. And so then it's helpful to have a border of stones or something to prevent all that good compost and topsoil that you've added from like eroding away, especially this is before it's filled in. This is the very first year when you're waiting for it to fill in and you don't want to lose all that soil running down your sidewalk. We always edge with some rocks or bricks or whatever people have on hand. And then, of course, we learned some things like my garden, sometimes it got trampled a bit in the beginning. So now I have a little tiny picket fence around it so people won't trample it, because it's right out there in the middle. We also, in terms of getting signs, we learned that was actually really hard for us. We were really great at getting plants in the ground, but getting signs was harder. And then the other thing we learned is that it's a great community building exercise to do this together. And people, when you put plants right out there in front, especially on that strip between the sidewalk and the street, like, everybody will start talking about it, and you'll have loads and loads of conversations with your neighbors and people you have been living next to and didn't really know before. So it's great, and mostly people are actually really enthusiastic about it. I haven't actually had any negative comments, despite the fact that my pollinator garden sometimes kind of like explodes out the edges and you can't walk by. So everyone's been really kind, actually. All right, this is you, I think, Christy.
Yeah. Okay. So, in case you're interested in doing something like this and starting a group in your neighborhood or getting a movement going, one of the things we found that was really important was some kind of signage that indicated that these different gardens are linked as part of a movement. And these signs were actually the thing that got the most people talking and asking, what is this thing that's happening in our neighborhood? So we actually found a neighbor who could make these for us, but you can order things like this online. And Anita made a website. We found the website was useful, but actually setting up a Facebook group turned out to be more useful. We created a group roster. And then every time we met someone who wanted to build their own pollinator garden, we would talk with them, and then we would recruit volunteers from the neighborhood. So we just went around talking to people about it all the time and asking, would you ever be interested in showing up to help build a pollinator garden? And we found lots of folks who were willing to. So then we would just have a garden building day, and we would get everyone out there that we could. And as soon as we had built the garden, a new sign would go in the ground. So then as these signs multiplied, more people said, how do I get one of those gardens? How do I get one of those signs? So we can go to the next slide there. Anita and I, or Kelly, and we've met lots of other experienced gardeners in our neighborhood. We would end up just chatting with the homeowner. We would often go over and look at their yard. We'd offer our amateur advice, help them figure out how to just do a sun map and, figure out how much sun they had, help them think through what plants they might want to plant. And then the homeowner's responsible for purchasing plants and any soil amendments. So on the build day, they've already gone and gotten all of this stuff. We just show up with our labor to help out. And so you can see here, you can go back and
Sorry,
see.
wrong one.
There's a before and after there of a family down the street. They wanted to dig up a good portion of the yard, and that's just some of the volunteers there. We can jump ahead. And you can see, and you can see on the left that that's the couple whose garden it was. On the right is a different build day. So you can see we have a ton of volunteers, a lot of them kids. So this is such a powerful experience to see all of these kids who are getting involved. And if we would often stop in the middle and just talk about, why are we doing this? And the kids remember more than the adults do about why we're doing it. Like, they can talk about pollinators and host plants, and and what's really cool, I'm just going to add this in, is that our kids have both gotten involved at their school at Coopertown Elementary in helping to start a pollinator garden as well. And my son has actually, I teach at Villanova, he's actually come and spoken to my students before, my college students, about his experience with this and about pollinator plants. So the kids are clearly learning a lot through the experience. We can go to the next slide.
Yep.
All right, that's you, Anita.
Yep. So our outreach has been pretty basic. Like, we go to the Coopertown Harvest Festival, which is one of the events organized by our civic association. We've put little blurbs in their newsletter. Like Christy said, we had a Facebook group and a lot of word of mouth in the pollination signs. So this is how we find new people who want to either expand or create from scratch pollinator gardens. And basically, what we've also found is, in terms of recruiting people, we sometimes get people who want to help volunteer, even though they don't have a pollinator garden in their own yard. They just want to help volunteer. We've also found people who really want to make a new pollinator garden, don't know a lot, and haven't volunteered before. But then once we've volunteered to help them build a pollinator garden, they usually get recruited as a volunteer to help other people build their pollinator gardens. So I have some more fun examples here of, like another family who we built a pollinator garden for. There was loads of kids there, and all of these people have since, then come to the next planting, right? It's sort of a knock-on effect. And you can see over here this sort of laborious procedure for removing the sod, where we've got people cutting out the sod here on the right, and the people on the left are actually on top of a tarp, and they're trying to whack off that precious dirt so that we can then just compost the grass part. And then, of course, involving the kids is really important, and it makes it a lot more fun too. As we're planting, as we're digging things out and planting, I remember specifically on this planting, it was so many people who walked by and were like, what are you guys doing? What's going on? And we recruited a whole bunch of new interest that way, just being out there in someone's front yard with a large group of people getting out there and planting together, it actually does a tremendous amount just to generate interest and build community. So I think, is that everything, Christy, that we wanted to say? I think that's all we have.
I think
Yeah,
that
we're happy to take questions. Yeah.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. So do you find anyone outside of Coopertown? Like, have you seen it grow to other parts of Havertown, or is it strictly just still, you know?
We haven't really thought about moving beyond Coopertown. I guess would be the fair answer to that, is that there's still a lot of places within, we actually still have a list of people within Coopertown who we haven't put in the garden yet for them. Like, they're on the list for this coming year. And there's still plenty of places that could certainly use an addition of native plants and pollinators. So we're still focusing on our neighborhood. The reason for being here today is just in case we inspire anyone to kind of do the same thing in their neighborhood. I don't think Christy or I or anyone in the group have the capacity to really go beyond Coopertown.
Yeah, did you hear that part in the
honestly.
beginning about how we have children and work full time?
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
Yeah.
And also, like, in terms of organization, it is a lot easier to do this with people in your neighborhood, because what you don't see is me walking my wheelbarrow across the neighborhood with all the supplies to the plantings. And
In
you
all your
don't
spare
see,
time.
right, and you don't see the people who have the small children, trading off. Like, the first half we get the mom and the kid, and the second half the kid has to take a nap, so then they go home and the dad comes over. Like, there's all these things that, like, it's a lot easier if you're right there and it's right in your neighborhood, and people can stop by for an hour and it's fine. We can use their help. It's not like a huge schlep. So that's, we're
Yeah.
very local for that.
No,
For
it's
those
great.
reasons.
It's wonderful. I'm surprised the other areas haven't, followed suit, but maybe I'll spread the word in Merwood.
Yeah, get going. We're happy to, like, give you any resources
That'd be
we've
great.
got.
I'm really inspired by your example and your enthusiasm. It's wonderful. I wanted to mention something in case it will reduce your workload that you might experiment with. And that is not improving the soil, not adding compost and topsoil. And I basically never do this on any property because a lot of native plants, especially generalist species, don't need enriched soil. And they'll do better and won't flop as much if you don't enrich the soil, because we tend to have a lot of nitrogen coming off the landscape anyway from the fertilizers people use and so forth. But I hear you about trying to deal with the compaction, and often the plant roots will do that on their own through time. And so if you want to improve the soil, or you're worried about a very compacted site, the best way to improve the soil is from the top down instead of adding it to the hole. Now, that's not a traditional recommendation. Traditionally, people did amend within the holes where they planted, for example, a tree, and that was always the recommendation. But studies have shown that those tree roots go round and round and round in that good loose soil, and they don't ever penetrate out into the native soils if you give them an enriched environment. So if you use a little bit of tough love up front, and pick species that can take the salt and the snow that might pile on and the dry, hot conditions on the road edge, for example, they'll generally be able to penetrate compacted soil unless the PSI, like the pressure, unless it's just really compacted from a truck driving over it or something, where you would have to rip the soil. But in general, the roots will infiltrate over time and do the job that you're trying to do by improving the soil up front. And the other reason not to disturb the soil by mixing anything in is because it often encourages a lot of weed germination, because any weeds that you turn up by disturbing the soil will germinate as soon as they get sunlight. So it can sometimes make it easier on you if you just scrape off the grass and don't do any further soil disturbance. And then the other thing that sometimes happens when we rototill or really turn soil is that we change the soil structure. And it looks looser at first, but as it settles more compacted than when you started. It seems counterintuitive, but it over time that can happen. So you might experiment with not working anything in. And part of the reason I encourage people not to work topsoil in, for example, is because it's less sustainable. If you begin to view your entire landscape as a space for native plantings, like you're not going to be able to amend all that soil.
Right.
You know, so it's sometimes just working with what you have is the best way to go, and reduces the barrier to entry for people who want to make changes too. But those are just thoughts that are not necessarily traditional, but can work with native plantings.
Yeah, I mean, we're surprised that even in the verge, it didn't really need too much. It didn't seem like it needed too much amendment, actually. Like my background right now is the plants that I have in that verge. And the first year, all I did was take a couple scoops of my homemade compost and kind of throw it on the top and then put the native plants in. And the native plants did great. I also got 500 tomato plants because it was homemade compost. But I had to pull out. But yeah, I've been surprised with the native plants. They don't seem to need much. I've also tried to do vegetables in that front section, and that's a totally different story. They do not do well unless you supplement. And but that just highlights the difference between these plants, right? And what they're capable of.
Absolutely. Vegetables, you need compost. Also, blueberries would be a native plant that I would say, yes, add loads of compost. But in general, you don't have to, like you say.
I wanted to take us back to the beginning of the questions. Michelle, there was when you were talking about, I forgot the name of it, but it was a kind of weed that had the different shaped leaf, and you were talking about having to deal with that first. There was a question of how do you deal with that?
I try to avoid talking about chemicals, but that's one that requires a chemical application if you want to remove it. It's lesser celandine. I encourage you to visit the Brandywine Conservancy. They have invasive species fact sheets. And that plant, if you try to remove it, you'll often make the problem worse because the little tubers break off so easily. It also creates bulblets in the leaf axils. So it's just very difficult to hand dig. I do hand dig it in certain parks where I volunteer, where I don't want to use chemicals, but it's very, very difficult. And I've seen it sweep across people's spaces like the entire backyard. And I've seen it smother asters, for example, which are otherwise 5 feet tall. So one way to handle it is to introduce annual native species that will fill the holes that are created by the lesser celandine. Another thing to do is to plant trees and shrubs because the lesser celandine can just grow beneath them. You sort of give up your ground layer, but you still have layers above that. The other thing to do is to try to smother it early in the season with the wood chips, like 8 to 12 inches of your wood chips, and try to smother it for an entire season, perhaps into the next year, to try to keep it from coming back. So I don't want to pretend to be an expert on that, but unfortunately, glyphosate is often what's used, and it's one of the least toxic chemicals that can be used in the landscape because it generally doesn't affect the soil and will allow other plants to come up in its place over time. Sometimes it's a matter of a tipping point. If you have a little bit, I encourage you to just dig it out and get it out right away. And you do not put it in the compost, you put it in the trash because it will spread all over. And but if you have a huge amount of it, it's often very difficult to truly get rid of. So we have to sort of play that game theory. But you can visit the Brandywine Conservancy invasive fact sheets to learn more about that.
There's another question about how do you recommend maintaining the border between turf grass and a native plant bed? And then does it try to spread? So Anita answered that question. It does.
Yes, Anita answered it really well, and she recuts her edges, which is a great idea. I do that yearly. First of all, I try to reduce the number of edges I have. So if I'm planting in a verge, I'll plant from edge to edge so that I only have 2 edges to maintain versus, 4, for example. And otherwise you recut the edge, or you put some kind of edger in, like stone or bricks or wood will often work well. And it, of course, won't be an issue if you don't have turf grass next to your native plantings, if you have more of a woodland. But in a sunny area, it is an issue, and you often just recut the edge once a year.
The next question is, where is the best place to buy native plants in the area? Anita, I know on their website they have some lists of those. Michelle or Jamie, did you have other suggestions?
I think I posted a response to the wrong comment, but there is a map that I posted in the chat that lists local sources for native plants. I know someone mentioned redbud. There's also a place called Good Host Plants that's in the city that you can order from and then go pick up. You can find them at local nurseries. You can order plant plugs. The ones we get because we're considered professionals, but you can order them online through a company called Izel. They'll sell you plant plugs. And you can also, there's a nursery not too far from here, I believe, that will sell to the public called Kind Earth Growers. I think through Penn State Extension, they're gonna hopefully start growing kits, like different types of native kits for different. So you would get like a flat of them, and they would have a mix of different plugs that would work in different scenarios. So if you wanted the plugs, though, I think Izel is one of the local ones that you can get them from, and I believe that they have to ship. But the map has a whole bunch of different, like native plant sales. I think Tyler Arboretum is having a native plant sale this weekend, which is another option to go to. So those all can work out.
Yes, and I also like the Jenkins Arboretum. They sell native plants at the front, just a wonderful diversity of native plants there. In addition to the Tyler Spring Plant Sale, there's also the Stoneley Plant Sale, and the Delaware Nature Society has a really good native plant sale. So some of those seasonal sales are good go-tos also.
And I don't know if it's all native, but I know Bartram's Gardens has an ongoing plant sale. You'd have to kind of pick and choose what might be native there, though.
And Scott
So.
has a question. Is there something we can do to create soft landing areas under mature trees with roots near the surface / partially exposed?
You choose very dry site species like mayapple and native ginger and white wood aster and white tinged sedge. Those grow well in dry conditions, also our roundleaf ragwort. But I don't recommend trying to plant right on top of the roots. For example, birch trees and maple trees can have really shallow, extensive roots, and pine trees. What you can do is plant where you feel like the plants will be successful at a little bit of a distance from the tree, and let them spread or seed if they're going to be successful over time if the conditions are right.
The other thing that I sometimes recommend, I'm going to show a picture, is that in the fall, if you just pile a whole, like if you have grass kind of under your trees and you want to get rid of it and you want to transform it to a tree well, you can just pile a lot of leaves in a big circle under the trees. And so I've done that under this persimmon tree. And what you can see is the border of grass all around it. And what happened is that the blue violet, the eastern violet, just volunteered here for me because I had a pile of leaves there. And instead of grass coming up, that's what came up the next year.
Perfect.
So that's an easy thing I like to tell people to do, is just try smothering it with a whole bunch of leaves and see if something better comes up.
Great idea.
We also had a comment about how that some of the natives, such as asters, jopieweed, coneflowers, fall over, and they have to stake them and stuff. And Jamie was suggesting maybe that they could do a Chelsea chopped. Can you talk to that?
So I do the Chelsea chop in my yard, especially for my asters. So in like mid to late June, I'll just hack them back aggressively. It's a little alarming when you do it, but it just makes the plant grow a little bit bushier and less lanky and tall, so it will flop. It was scary the first time I did it, but I do it every year now, and it works out. But I don't know what Michelle thinks about that or anybody else, but it works for me.
I agree with you. Sometimes it's necessary. If I have an aster in a space where I really want it and it flops, I just stake it up. I'll cut it back. Sometimes that helps. Like you say, it branches. Another thing to do is to put plants that are tall into conditions that are a little leaner than they would otherwise like, and it will help to restrict their growth. So again, we're not enriching the soils, will help them not to grow too tall and flop over. You can also grow tall plants near native grasses that are very upright, or shrubs that help to hold them up. So if you know which way a plant flops, you can put something in front of it to help hold it up, for example. But yes, cutting back anything that blooms late, like asters and goldenrods, you can cut back before July 4th and they will still bloom in the later season. And you can experiment with all kinds of other plants too.
There's a question. What if you have stilt grass in your yard that seems hard to keep from coming back?
Stilt grass is an annual. So if you cut it back in early August before it sets seed, you'll prevent it from setting seed for the next year. Not to say that it won't come back, because the seed will last in the seed bank for many years, but it's one strategy to reduce it over time. It's also very easy to pull without disturbing the soil very much. The thing to do is to get other vigorous plants going in its space, like when you pull it or when you cut it back, to get something like golden ragwort or our white wood aster, things like that that spread really rapidly to take its space.
Great. And there was one more question that was in here, and there was a question, is that trumpet vine behind Michelle?
It is.
This is, well, so yeah, this is, it has trumpet shaped flowers. This is our native honeysuckle, our coral honeysuckle, Lonicera sempervirens. This is a May blooming plant usually, and it's what the male hummingbirds come for. They're the first ones to migrate from Mexico, and so they often use this plant. And what's traditionally called trumpet vine is a little bit different. It's a more vigorous plant that pops up sort of in our spaces, also native, but this one we call coral honeysuckle, but they both have red flowers, definitely.
Any tips for removing I don't know how to say it, zoysia grass?
Zoysia grass.
So
You can do it the same way with regular grass, like everyone recommended. I just helped my neighbor get rid of a whole bunch of zoysia to turn into a native pollinator. It's definitely harder to cut through, I think, than, like Kentucky bluegrass, but the same kind of methods will work.
any other questions? We thank you guys for staying on. This lasted a little bit longer than anticipated, but all very good information.
So I just want to add one really cool thing, which is that the more I've added native plants to my yard, the more I see wildlife, so I see birds coming through. But then I had this surprising thing happen, which was that more native plants that I didn't purchase or intentionally plant started appearing in my yard. Like just something would be growing and I would identify it and it would be a native plant. And I'm sure it's just because more birds are coming through and so more seeds are being dispersed. So that was just really exciting for me to see that there was a kind of restoration that happened where the system itself kicked in beyond what I was doing.
Wonderful.
There's a question, is mock strawberry really bad?
It's not really bad. It's just a little bit annoying. It's not a native plant that's supporting wildlife, whereas our native strawberry supports a tremendous amount of wildlife. It's a great host plant. So it can kind of spread in your perennial gardens in a way that keeps you busy in the winter pulling it out. But it's easy to see in the winter or cutting it out because it's evergreen that way.
Any other questions? Somebody can unmute.
I think I saw somebody asked about native hedges, shrubs for native hedges maybe. And I just wanted to recommend of course you want to look at your site conditions and see how much sun and shade and moisture you have, but our native viburnums and our native dogwood shrubs and our native northern bayberry and our inkberry holly, some of our larger inkberry hollies are really good shrubs. Not all of them are evergreen, but they're very twiggy to help provide privacy if that's what you're going for.
Well, I think we have maxed out our brains tonight. So thank you all for presenting. Thank you for coming. And I wish you the best of luck choosing your plants, choosing the right spot, and also encouraging others to do the same.
And look out in your inbox for the information about where to come and when to come to get free native plant plugs, because I don't want them at my house much longer than they have to be.
Great to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you for everyone coming.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks so much.
The recording will go, a link to the recording will also go out in the email for the with the plant plugs.
Thank you.
Thanks for organizing.